Good morning. Had a great time last night at the trivia night. If you didn't come, you missed out. I won't say you ought to be ashamed of yourselves, but I'll think it to myself. No, just kidding. But you missed a great time. And a great challenge as well. In fact, it was kind of funny. Somebody thought it would be a good idea, a funny joke, to name Joe's team. Always Right was the name of Joe's team. And what was not as funny was when fate turned the tables a little bit and it turned out that I landed on Joe's team. So that wasn't as funny, but we did all right. We made it. Thankfully, she forgot to bring her hearing aid, so she wasn't really too much of a part of it. She was kind of on her own team within our team, but no, she can. Well, that's what the board said anyway.
And with her argument, we did gain an extra half point.
We did, well, she did the arguing, yeah. She argued for a point that we missed. That was the funny thing, is our team was called Always Right, and then we missed a question on the first category, the easy category. We missed one of them, so almost always right. Today we're looking at lesson 50 of this study of the life of Christ, going through the ministry, or the life rather, of Jesus. This is almost the last. This is the second to last lesson in this section, I think. I don't think it's the last. Can't remember. It's either the last or second to last, and then this part, we'll get into part 7. This is the rest of Jesus' second year of ministry, looking at Matthew 15 and Mark 7. So either one of those that you would turn to would be helpful. I think we'll probably use Mark's account a little bit more, so if you want to turn to Mark, but both would be handy. We're going to learn a new place on our map here in this section. We'll see it in just a second, but it's a little strip of land near the Mediterranean Sea, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, that doesn't appear in the New Testament very often. It's called Phoenicia, and whether or not you've heard of that territory, you've definitely heard of the two prominent cities of that territory, which are called Tyre and Sidon, and that's going to play a role in our lesson here today. Another part that's going to play a role again is the Decapolis, which we'll see that in just a second as well. But if you remember, a few lessons ago, Jesus had determined that he and his disciples needed to withdraw from all the excitement that had been building up, and it didn't quite work out. He tried, but wherever he went, people found out and they showed up, and he never could get that rest, that respite that they needed, especially from those events at Bethsaida, Julius. But that resolve and decision had not changed. He still decided and knew that he needed to get that withdrawal. He needed that break. They needed that rest, that little breathing space. And if anything, it may have been intensified since all these events happened. So now, it's not that it had changed, but he needed it even more. They more and more, as time went on, without it, they needed it more and more. So if you think about that outburst that ended up almost getting him crowned as king, and he had to dismiss them. Then the run-in with the scribes from Jerusalem that we looked at Wednesday night about the washing of hands, that happened the next day. Then the discussions on the Sabbath day that were in that immediate section after that. All these things led up to a necessity of a break now more than ever. And then we know that he had to go to Capernaum from where he left at Bethsaida Julius, and then he would have spent the Sabbath there. But as soon as that was over, he was going to resume that journey to get out a little bit, go out a little bit to get that much needed rest. And he ended up going to a place that he probably would not have gone if it weren't for the very peculiar circumstances that he found himself and his disciples really in at this time. So as far as we know, this is the first time that Jesus ever went to this area. It's not the first time that he went to the Decapolis, as he will at the end of our lesson here. But if you can remember, just think to yourself or think back if you can remember what happened the last time Jesus went around this area. Just tuck that away, and it's going to be an interesting contrast that we'll see with the lesson, with the situation here. So, I'm going to start by reading Mark chapter, actually we'll save that. Mark 7, beginning in verse 24, says, and this is probably going to sound familiar because we based the sermon last week on this verse, this statement. Mark 7:24 says, "And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately," we'll stop there, "went to the region of Tyre and Sidon." Notice it doesn't say he went to those cities. He went to the region of those cities. So we don't know exactly, but the language seems pretty clear that he did enter into that region, which is Phoenicia. Again, there's the bottom part of it. It's a sliver there that gets a little bit wider as you go north, but still not very far into the land. But Tyre and Sidon were very famous, notorious cities. We've heard of them. We read about them in the Old Testament. We read about them in the New Testament. What might we say is the most remarkable trait about these cities and this region in general in the context of Jesus and his ministry? Remember, he went to Phoenicia. Okay, it's outside of Israel, which means there could be Jews there, but as a rule, it's not a Jewish territory. It is, not as a rule, it is not a Jewish territory. It's not an Israelite territory, even though Rome owned it all at this point. It's a Gentile land. The Jews would still view Israel as a special land, God's land, the Holy Land, even though Rome owned all of it. But Phoenicia was not part of that. So Jesus is leaving Israel. Not only, we read before how he left the territory of Herod upon hearing about the death of John the Baptist, but he just went outside the region, technically outside of Israel because he crossed the Jordan, but not very far. Now he's taking that resolve further than ever before, and he's going to the farthest that he has ever gone, with the exception of when he was a baby. And Herod the Great was wanting to kill him, and the angel told Joseph, y'all need to leave and go to Egypt for the safety of the child. With that exception, and it's hard to even count that, I guess, with that one exception, this is the farthest Jesus will ever go on the earth in his life on the earth. That's kind of interesting because it's not that far, is it? It's farther than he's ever gone, but it's not that far. And yet, Jesus, that's the farthest that he ever walked, that he ever went in the flesh, other than the trip to Egypt when he was a baby. So, this was a significant trip, but maybe more significant is the interesting fact that Mark points out that he didn't want anybody to know that he was there. Not in that region, but at this house. He went to a house. He entered a house. What house? I don't know. Somebody's house. Don't know who they were, how they knew Jesus, or who they knew, but somebody was hospitable to him. But he didn't want anybody to know that he was there. But, as has happened before, that never works out. He could not be hidden. If Jesus is there, somebody's going to find out. It seems to be impossible for Jesus' location to be hidden, to be kept a secret. No matter whether the host here had the best of intentions, it's almost like you can't trust anybody. If you tell somebody, even your closest peers, that Jesus is, here, there, or somewhere else, they're going to tell somebody, and then everybody's going to know. I mean, all the people all around. Well, what usually happened when people discovered where Jesus was? In Israel. They brought people there. What kinds of people did they bring? Sick people, crippled people, demon-possessed people, all sorts of hurting people with different disabilities or struggles. Now, here, even in Phoenicia, that was no exception. That's exactly what seems to have happened here. Maybe not tons of people, but at least we read about this one person. Beginning in verse 25, we'll read down through verse 30. It says, "But immediately," Mark's favorite word, "a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter." Actually, we won't read down to verse 30 yet. Let's let that sink in first. As soon as Jesus' location was known by this woman, she headed that way. She came to him, and she fell down at his feet in worship and in honor. But this woman was a Gentile. Maybe that implies that the house he was staying at was the house of a Jew, of the dispersion, outside of Israel. And likely, we can likely assume that it was regardless. But this woman was a Gentile. Now, what had Jesus told his apostles, his 12 disciples, when he sent them out in pairs in the limited commission? Do not go to anyone but the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, don't go to Gentiles. Well, Jesus did not, strictly speaking, did not go to this woman. She came to him. He did go to a Gentile territory. Now a Gentile woman is here. And we may think, now that she's here, it'll probably be a little bit different. Well, let's read on. It says, she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Yikes. That sounds offensive, doesn't it? That's a good way to get yourself slapped in the face. Yeah, that's not politically correct. Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, the first part, not that controversial. In fact, logically speaking, literally, according to that analogy, that's just common sense, isn't it? You're going to feed the children before you feed the dogs, and even if you have a pet dog, the children will be fed first. Then generally people will give the dogs the leftovers. Well, he says it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And now he throws the dogs in. Who's the dog in this little parable thing? Yeah, the Gentiles, which is her. So Jesus is seemingly, at least, calling her a dog in this illustration. He didn't say, "Get out of here, you filthy dog." Okay, that'd be a little bit different, quite a bit different actually. But he does imply that she's the dog in this picture. Now, that may shock us to read, and I think it's at least worth noting that the word he uses for dog is different the point has been made at least, different than some words that could be used for dog. Now, dogs, when we think about a dog, we generally view them favorably. Most of us like dogs, unless we've had some sort of traumatic experience with dogs. But most of us like dogs. Even cat people like dogs, no matter what they say. They like dogs and they know it, okay? But in the East, Middle East at least, dog is not going to conjure up fuzzy puppy feelings. But dogs to them are a nuisance. Because they would think about the stray dogs that can sometimes, terrorize a town or a village that is almost like an infestation. Dogs all over the place, or at least these stray dogs coming around, the wild, maybe feral creatures. But it's been noted that the word Jesus uses for dogs here is not the same word that would be used of a dog in that way. So that may soften it a little bit. In fact, does anybody's translation say something different than dogs? At all different? Maybe an adjective in there? I don't know of any, but I think I have heard of some alternate possible translations, just never actually seen one translated that way. Okay, little dogs. That's a little better. We would call that a puppy, a little dog, but that's a little bit better, a little bit softer. But at any rate, what is maybe even more shocking than the fact that Jesus responded this way, and let's not forget, Jesus knows what He's doing all the time. He never did anything that was not calculated and measured, and usually, if not always, had a specific point and purpose to every step and move that He made. And this is no exception. He was doing something here. He was onto something. Now, her response to Him is even more impressive, or more shocking maybe. Because like I said, a lot of people would, their response would be smacking Him across the face. Or cursing Him and taking her daughter by the hand and leaving, or, if she had her daughter with her at that point. But it seems that the daughter was at home, but she would storm out and go to her daughter. Now, she said this, "Yes, Lord." Already not what we would expect. "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now, I would submit that we don't have to understand exactly what she meant by that. I think we could, it's not that too far out there, but let me just make the point that the fact that she responded to it so humbly, almost favorably and agreeably, is what floored Him, what moved Him. She said, "Yes, Lord," accepting what He just said. And then she showed herself to, be pretty sharp. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She'd be happy with just crumbs that fall down. Isn't that what the dogs look for? Sometimes you give them the food. Not in my house, please. Although we have been lately because our dog's very sick. So remember him, if you will. Remember Tabby, for the sake of our dog. I have caved a little bit and given him food. But usually they wait for food to fall. And usually it falls from the kids. Because when kids eat, the food goes here, there, and everywhere except their mouths. She's saying she'd be fine with that. The crumbs that fall. That not deliberately given. But she'd be satisfied. Every now and then, the dogs under the table will get some food that falls from the table, the crumbs that fall. And they may never know about it. May just go under the radar just as much as it's under the table. That was her rebuttal. It is a rebuttal of sorts. She's not giving up. She's saying, yeah, but, true as that is, sometimes the dogs get food that falls under the table. Maybe a little hint there, a little implication, but Jesus was moved by this.
In Matthew's account, it says that the
Okay, from the master's table. Some implication there.
To that?
Yeah, that would be an implication, maybe, that of, Jesus, master. Very, very, very well likely, possible. So, Jesus said to her, for this statement, you may go your way. Well, that's not what she wanted. No, the demon has left your daughter. She went home, found the child lying in bed, and the demon gone. Don't know how she could tell, but she could. It was gone. She was back, she was herself again. Just her normal self in the fullest sense of the term. So, kind of significant. Jesus says, He doesn't necessarily say because of your faith, although that is part of this. Oh, woman, great is your faith. But Mark's account says, for this statement. In other words, it was her faith as manifested in something that she did, which in this case was responded in a way that Jesus marveled at and was moved by. For this statement, you can go on home because your daughter is already better. The demon has left your daughter. Now, as impressive as it was to read and to the people that saw it when Jesus told a demon to leave and they did, He didn't do any of that here. He didn't even see the girl. Wasn't even told where she is, it seems. And He didn't speak to the demon or to the girl or anybody. He just said, hey, you can go home. Your daughter, the demon's left. And she went home, and the demon was gone. Jesus, His compassion again is seen, His power. But He was definitely testing that woman. That statement was a test. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And she passed with flying colors. I mean, she nailed it. So, what lessons could we learn from this incident here? Well, I just mentioned a couple. Jesus' compassion. What lesson can we learn about the Gentile status?
At that time?
Well, at that time or in the whole picture, as opposed to the way the Jews looked at them. According to the Jews, what could you say about Gentiles as far as their spiritual state goes and their spiritual hope? They didn't have any. They're defiled, unclean, lost, unholy, and there's nothing they could do to have any hope except stop being a Gentile. Become a Jew. Bind yourself to the law of Moses, put yourself into the yoke of the law, become a proselyte, become one of those special people, like the eunuch, Ethiopian eunuch seems to have been. Well, they weren't too far from the truth because in a way, that is sort of the truth of it. In order for all of us, we have no hope unless we stop being a Gentile in the way Paul used that term later, or the way Peter used it, or a similar term or phrase, that we need to be mindful of how we act before the Gentiles. And Paul said we don't need to act like Gentiles. In that way, the only way for us to have hope is to stop being Gentiles, but not in the way the Jews thought. Jesus here showed that even though the kingdom was going to be offered and open to the Jews first, notice He says, let the children be fed first. Not the bread's for the children, get out of here, you nasty dog. But let the children be fed first. For it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dog. Well, she was okay with that. But the lesson is seen here. God viewed the Gentiles differently than the Jews did. And they needed to learn. The disciples, remember, they're here. They're seeing this. They needed to learn. They needed to get that into their heads that God's plan includes the Gentiles. Always did. You know, the very first promise to Abraham about, I'm going to make you the father of many nations and so on, includes the Gentiles. It's a prophecy of the church. And the very first one has the Gentiles right in there. It's going to be opened to them, to everybody, not just one people, but all people, all the families of the earth. Well, Jesus taught that lesson time and time again. If you remember a few lessons back, I don't remember how long ago, he made the point that whenever there was a drought in the land of Israel, God didn't send any prophet he didn't send Elijah to any Jewish widows. He sent them to Zarephath, which I meant to point out on the map. You might see it in a second. Is right up there. Jesus was very close to there, right here in this house with this woman. That was a Gentile place and a Gentile woman. Same thing at other times in the history. Lepers. Surely there were plenty of Jewish lepers over time, Israelite lepers. Elisha didn't heal any of them. God didn't heal any of them, except Naaman, a Syrian Gentile. And they did not like that statement at all. They didn't like the implication. Even though how could that be offensive? How dare you suggest that God would help somebody? You know, why would anybody find that offensive? Well, because of their air of superiority and puffed up pride. But Jesus did not adhere to that, and he taught his disciples in a very practical and open way, but very maybe tactful. He taught that lesson, not just by telling them, but he showed it. And that's definitely a lesson that they needed to learn in this. Also learn that persistence is very important, especially in our lives as far as prayer is concerned. This woman didn't give up. She could have taken that as a no, because in a way it was a no, wasn't it? But she didn't give up right there. She kept trying, and guess what? It worked. Persistence. God's response may not always be what we want to hear. How come God doesn't answer my prayers? He does. That's the answer. Too many times we confuse no answer with just not the answer I wanted. Everything I pray for, it doesn't happen. That's still an answer. Did your parents give you everything you wanted? I hope not. I doubt they did. Doesn't take us long in life to learn that no is an answer, because we hear it a lot. My little sister used to have a shirt when she was a baby that said, "My name is not no-no," because that's what you say to kids all the time. Well, sometimes the answer that we get is not what we want to hear. But he knows best, and his will is what's most important. Jesus knew the hearts of people, and his interactions and results were based on the faith of those individuals. In this case, like we pointed out, her statement, he says in Mark's account, for this statement, what you've just shown, he didn't read her heart, he didn't read her mind. She showed her heart, and she showed her mind by what she did. And other times, Jesus saw people's faith, and this is one of those examples. Any other thoughts, comments on that section?
So I'm thinking of the crumbs falling to the floor. I mean, even in our lives, we do that by our actions and our words. It's kind of like leaving crumbs for other people to kind of pick up.
Yeah.
That can lead them
Little crumbs. Little seeds. And we should have that humble attitude of, if I can just get some crumbs. It's very similar to if I can just touch the fringe of His garment. I mean, it's almost the exact same concept. We need to get to Jesus, and if we can just touch the fringe of His garment, that's all it'll take. If I can just get some crumbs, and if we're eager just to at least catch some crumbs, we're going to catch a whole lot more than crumbs. We'll find a feast. If we come to the Scriptures seeking crumbs, or the assemblies seeking crumbs, although that's not why we should come to the assemblies, but it's definitely a pretty good byproduct, we will find a feast. So Jesus then is going to return to the Decapolis. Remember, He's trying to avoid Herod's territory. And so as He's going to leave the land of the region of Tyre and Sidon, He's going to proceed to the region of the Decapolis, which is across the Jordan. Most of it's across the Jordan. This green area down here on the bottom right of the map there. Remember that up there in that blue is where Phoenicia is. That's where they left. There's Zarephath right there, right in between Tyre and Sidon, where the widow was where Elijah went. So Jesus is going to go to the Decapolis, means 10 cities, that region there, because He's trying to stay away from Herod and get that much needed rest if He can find it. So He travels along the sea, He gets there, and then in Matthew 15, verse 30, guess what happened? Great crowds came to Him. And guess what they were doing? Bringing Him the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. They put Him at His feet. Here you go, Jesus. Found some more for you. So Jesus went on from there, this is verse 29, Jesus went on from there, walked beside the Sea of Galilee, went up on the mountain and sat down there, and here come all the people. And just like we pointed out in another lesson when we saw this same thing, the way that most of us would respond to that, react, probably a lot different than the way Jesus did. Here we'd be like, every time I sit down and try to rest and think, these people won't leave me alone. Just leave me alone. For 1 minute, just give me something. But we don't see Jesus doing that. He healed them. In fact, Mark records a specific healing. A certain deaf and mute man. In Mark 7, verses 31 through 37, it says, Then He returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to Him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. So maybe he wasn't totally mute, but he had a speech impediment. And they begged Him to lay His hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, He put His fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. Yummy. When's the last time another adult human being touched your tongue? That wasn't a doctor with a stick, if they even do that still. Looking up to heaven, He sighed and said to him some word that means, be open. Too many P's and H's and T's and H's in that one. And his ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more He charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So, this is one of the more pictorial displays of Jesus' healing. It kind of leads to the question, why did He do that? We know He doesn't need to do that. He could have just thought, I guess, and he would have been healed. We know he wasn't doing this for a show to the people because Mark very explicitly points out before he did this, he went away from the crowd privately. How privately, we don't know, but seemingly enough for Mark to use that word. Maybe just his disciples were there, his closest disciples, but he was away from the crowd. Put his fingers in his ears, and then he spit and touched his tongue. Now, let me know if your translation words it any differently, but at least in the ESV, it doesn't necessarily say that he spit on his fingers, the fingers that he touched his tongue with, although that could very well be the implication. But regardless of where he spat, again, he had no reason to do this. I mean, no obligation. He, like I said, he always had a reason. The key is, when he did this, and then he looked up to heaven and he sighed and said, "Be open," he could hear. And it says his tongue was released. Whatever his speech impediment was, or muteness, or it may have been so severe that he may as well have been mute because he couldn't really talk. Not all deaf people are mute, but if they're completely deaf, it's very difficult for them to, even if they're mostly deaf, it's very difficult for them to speak, and so they usually don't, even though they can make sounds and maybe could even speak to an extent that they could be understood with some effort. Whatever his particular impediment was, it's gone now. And everybody that was there, whether they saw what Jesus did or not, they knew that he was brought there deaf and mute or with a severe speech impediment. He went aside privately with Jesus. He comes back. He's not deaf anymore, and he can speak totally properly. Now, Jesus told him, "Don't tell anybody." By this time, we can understand why he keeps saying this. Because even though he keeps saying this, this is what keeps happening. Everywhere he goes, people find out somehow. How in the world are people finding out? There's no internet. No cell phones. These people had something figured out. They knew how to, chain communicate before telephones or anything.
Even if the man didn't go running around saying, "Look, I can speak, I can hear," it was obvious to everybody who knew him that he could now speak and hear.
Yeah.
And, if they ask, how did this happen? Unless he lies.
Yeah, that's the natural thing that's going to happen. He probably had things that he did. He had a routine like we all do. He went to similar places. He had to do things in life, even though he's deaf and has a speech impediment. He's not, totally disabled and unable to do anything. So he's going to continue to do those things, wouldn't he? Let's say he goes to the market or something, and he approaches the vendor, and he's going to suddenly speak to them and hear what they say back, and that person's going to be very confused. And the first thing they're going to say is, if they can even put it into words, they're going to be like, "What is this business? What's going on? Is this a dream? How is it that you're talking? This never happened before." And obviously this is after the people that he knows in his immediate family and circle, who would probably have already known about it by then. And that's just going to happen every time he comes across a person that he is acquainted with. That's how it's going to be. It's not going to take long. That person is going to tell every single person that they know. "Remember so-and-so? So-and-so, you're not going to believe what happened to him." Everybody's going to, and Mark says, the more he charged them, as a rule, not these particular people, I don't think, but just as a rule, he charged them specifically, but then as a rule, overall, the more he charged people, the more they go out and tell. What a strange phenomenon. I don't think that implies that Jesus was doing it on purpose. Not that he wanted them to. Reverse psychology. I don't think Jesus played reverse psychology, at least in this kind of situation. If I tell them not to, I bet they'll do it. So I'll tell them not to. No, he didn't want them to. But the more what else could he do? It's not like he's going to catch on to this and then say, well, maybe if I tell them to, they won't. No, he's just going to tell them what he wants, plainly and up front. Don't tell anybody. But here's where it says their reaction was that they were astonished beyond measure. But the way they communicated it was, he's done all things well. Now let's think back. Turn back to Mark 5 in verse 16. Beginning in 16. This is what Mark recorded 2 chapters earlier. Actually, I'll just start in verse 15. Nope, I will start in verse 14. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. This is that he cast demons out of this man, and they went into the pigs. People came to see what it was that had happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. That's a lot different than this, isn't it? He went away, verse 20 says, began to proclaim in the Decapolis. So that's where Jesus was. He was in the region of the Decapolis. And that time, they begged Jesus to leave. And the only reason they would do that is because they thought that he had done something that was not well. Now they concluded, he has done, how is it worded? All things well. Okay. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Maybe that played a role in Mark 7, you're saying? He told everybody. And it says everyone marveled. But now it seems by the time Jesus' next visit to the Decapolis, that it was different. And now they concluded, whether they're including in that statement, of course, all things, we would say, means all things. I mean, all means 100%. But in their minds, whether they were thinking about that thing that happened with the pigs and all that, they concluded, he has done all things well. That statement was more true than they realized, because Jesus did do, literally, all things well. But they were mainly talking about, look at how he's helping people. I can't help but think that they would have applied that, most of them, the ones that knew about the pig situation, would think back and retrospectively apply that to that situation. Now they see he helped that, he saved that man. They were blinded by the whole situation. They didn't see the good in it because of their fear and confusion. But now it seems like they did. They see it now. He's done all things well. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, musings, and criticisms?
What is the significance of the deep sigh? And the author gave his opinion on it, and I think it's worth considering. That is showing Jesus' compassion for the downtrodden.
Yeah.
And all of us could probably reach a little bit more compassion, less fortunate.
Yeah, we could.
More compassion.
Definitely could use more compassion. And it's almost like he looks up to heaven and he sighs. Jesus was probably so exhausted by all the hurt and pain and the state of the world. But he did something about it. And if we share that feeling with him, then we need to do something about it. We can't do what he did, but we can do what we can by his example. But we got to have that compassion.